Most people are so ungrateful to be alive. Game over.
Now, wait just a darn minute.
Game over.
Now, wait just
another
darn minute.
I want to play a game.
Fuck you!
Once a year from 2004 to 2010, horror audiences got to follow the Saw saga, the 7-film story of the Jigsaw killer John Kramer, who kidnapped those whom he thought didn't deserve their lives and gave them a shot at redemption. Or else. The franchise has a bit of a love it or hate it reputation, with it becoming one of the most popular horror franchises of all time, even if a lot of people see it as just shallow torture porn that dragged on far longer than it needed to. But one thing that the franchise had going for it was that whether or not you think the sequels were necessary, it did have an ongoing story that at least somewhat justified them. It didn't just conclude the series and then artificially extend it later on like a lot of other horror series tend to do. And then 2017 happened. In the last few years, we've seen the release of an 8th and 9th movie with a 10th just around the corner. And that raises two big questions. Are they any good? And considering what we just talked about, are they necessary? Was it worth bringing this story back after Jigsaw's games were seemingly over? Well, let's take a look and see. Starting with the first of the two, Jigsaw. The story takes place a decade after the events of the previous film and focuses on a brand new set of victims being abducted for a game that seems to somehow involve Jigsaw despite him being dead for years.
While I am certain that there is a desire to point fingers at me, unless you turn that finger inward, I assure you, more blood will be lost.
The victims wake up in an abandoned barn and, in typical Saw fashion, have to overcome deadly traps meant to punish them for their sins. Meanwhile, the local police are investigating the kidnappings to track them down and also figure out who's responsible.
It's not him. Can't be. Right?
I think we should start by talking about what everyone watches these movies for, the traps. And yeah, these are pretty good. Much like the previous movies, the traps are very creative and have a lot of variety while still maintaining this kind of industrial DIY aesthetic, being constructed from mundane objects like buckets, buzz saws, farm equipment, etc. And much like the other Saw movies, they do a good job of creating a sense of panic with the ticking clock element, the fact that you often don't immediately know the solution, and the loud music juxtaposed with quieter moments of dread and claustrophobia. Tobin Bell also returns to play Jigsaw once again, and honestly, fair play to this guy for continuing to appear in these movies even after all this time, because he's just straight up the perfect actor to play Jigsaw. The character has always been depicted as a man who believes he's righting wrongs and doing what's necessary despite the fact that he's a sadistic serial killer. And Tobin Bell portrays him with this calm and unsympathetic attitude, which really gets across the idea that he has no remorse for what he does to his victims because he believes it's for their own good.
And that wouldn't have been necessary if you'd simply played by the rules. But you don't like rules, do you?
So looking at the movie purely from a horror perspective, I think the movie is entertaining. But while the traps are interesting, I can't really say the same about the actual victims. We mainly follow 4 victims throughout the traps, and each of them are in some way responsible for the deaths of other people, which is why Jigsaw has targeted them. None of them are really engaging characters though, because their backstories are all just kind of glanced over in short flashbacks and exposition, and then are rarely, if ever, mentioned again. None of them develop or learn from their mistakes, and they don't go into much detail about why these characters did the things they did. For example, one of the victims named Anna struggled with stress from family life, so she smothered her baby and framed her husband. That could be really interesting to go into, but the movie does nothing to explore why she was struggling or the desperation she was facing to where she was willing to do such a terrible thing. They just show it in a very matter-of-fact way, and that's it.
But your poor husband, Matthew, I know the two of you didn't always get along.
I'm not saying that every single one of these characters needed their backstory fleshed out. I'm fine if you want to make a couple of them just irredeemable bastards, but it would be nice if at least one of them got some kind of character development. Instead, the movie just treats them as blood bags with a shady past, and none of them have much in the way of personality. The only one that has any to speak of is this guy named Ryan, but even then he's pretty one note. His character is that he's inconsiderate and sarcastic. That's basically all there is to him.
Sold bad mortgages, sold good coke, cheated on my taxes, cheated on my wife, both of them. Nothing that bad.
You can argue that this level of characterization and storytelling has sort of been a thing in other Saw movies, and that it's not super surprising that it's also the case here. But when I think back to the best and most memorable Saw movies, they tend to be the ones where the characters and their past mistakes are actually given some amount of attention, so that we actually see the humanity in these characters and be invested in whether they survive. None of the victims in this movie survive to the end, but even if every single one of them made it out completely unscratched, it wouldn't really affect any kind of point the movie is making, because we know practically nothing about them or what difference it makes if they make it out alive. And while I'm on the subject, what is the point of this line?
Well, then I hope for all of our sakes that it is a game.
Oh yeah, why is that, sweetheart?
This game's gonna be won.
None of them do survive, and we aren't meant to root for them to survive, so why is the movie trying to make this situation seem hopeful? And while the traps are entertaining, they also don't really seem as inescapable as the movie wants you to think. Like this trap here, why don't they just try using the buzzsaws to cut the chains? I mean, one of them tries it at one point, but all he does is just whip the chain, which, I mean, obviously that's not going to work. Or how about the fact that the barn has barred windows and wood plank walls that you can see daylight through? They look flimsy enough that you could probably just start bashing them with the farm equipment that's laying around and break your way out. I can't guarantee that would work, but it seems more feasible than trying to tear bars off a window with your bare hands. Speaking of that, there's a scene late in the movie where Anna and Ryan manage to briefly escape the barn only to be attacked and sedated by Jigsaw himself. So basically, Jigsaw took a long look at himself, a terminally ill cancer patient who's barely clinging onto life, and thought he'd be the best line of defense if they happened to get out. What was his plan if all 5 victims had survived up until then? Was he gonna take all of them on himself? And for that matter, how did Jigsaw even know half of these people? I mean, Anna was his next door neighbor, and this guy Mitch killed his nephew, but Carly and Ryan are never established to have met Jigsaw, and their crimes apparently happened years ago and they seemingly got away with it, so how does he know about it? In fact, we're 8 movies in at this point and Jigsaw is still finding new victims. How many criminals and generally evil people did John Kramer meet in his life? Didn't he live a pretty normal life before he became a murderer? But I digress. There's a whole other half of the movie to talk about. It focuses on a police detective named Halloran investigating the new kidnappings and thinking that 2 pathologists working on the case named Logan and Eleanor may be responsible.
Where were you the night Malcolm Neal got murdered?
Home.
Can you prove that?
And to be blunt, this part of the plot really sucks. For one thing, it's very obvious early on who the killer is. Put it this way, if you're watching a horror movie with a murder mystery element and there's one character that the story doesn't try to lead you to suspect, it's probably them. The movie initially tries to make you think that Eleanor is the killer because she's interested in Jigsaw, even recreating a bunch of his old traps out of fascination.
It's beautiful, isn't it?
But it's such an obvious red herring because if she was the killer, the movie would absolutely not be this heavy-handed about it. But if I want to talk about who the killer actually is, I gotta go over the plot twist. Strap yourself in because this is gonna take some explaining. It's eventually revealed that Logan is the killer and the game we've been watching throughout the movie was actually a flashback to when Jigsaw was alive. Logan was one of the victims in the game and seemingly died right at the beginning, but Jigsaw saved him.
John decided I shouldn't have to die over an honest mistake.
Which begs the question of why did he put him in the trap to begin with? But Jigsaw then took him under his wing as an apprentice, and the game that Halloran has been investigating has actually been a recreation of the one that we've been watching, this time orchestrated by Logan. The big problem with the police investigation is that there's barely any actual plot throughout these sequences. It's revealed that Logan's big plan was to lure Halloran into a trap as punishment for being a corrupt cop who let criminals walk, including one that killed Logan's wife. But much like the other trap victims, the movie doesn't show much of Halloran's backstory and the things he's done. There's little to no insight into why he let criminals go or how he justified it to himself beyond some vague statements.
I did some shitty things, but the system's broken. I tried to fix it.
On top of that, it's not something that we actually see him do throughout the movie, and it's not even something that the plot revolves around. He barely interacts with any criminals, he isn't shown interfering with investigations, he comes off less like a corrupt cop and more like just kind of a dick. So when he's confronted about it during the climax, it doesn't hit as strongly as it should because up until then, it's not really what the film has been about. It feels less like a natural conclusion to the story we've been following and more something that was just tacked on at the last minute because the story needs a climax. And Logan's backstory about losing his wife isn't really given any attention either. We don't see any flashbacks of him grieving, and in the present he seems to be handling it fairly well, so I don't see any reason to care about him. You might be getting the impression that I don't like this movie, but to be honest, that's not really true. Like I said, the traps and general atmosphere of the movie are pretty well done and are big parts of why I'm watching a Saw movie. In that regard, I think the movie as a whole is okay. It's just dragged down by a very shallow story and characters. But to answer my earlier question of, was it worth bringing the Saw franchise back for this? Well, yes and no. At the end of the day, it's another Saw movie. If you just want another Saw movie that has enough fun and gruesome traps, that it will probably suffice. But if you were hoping this might take the franchise in some compelling new direction, this is not gonna cut it, so make of that what you will. But then in 2021, we got another new Saw movie titled Spiral from the Book of Saw.
Wait, I thought the Jigsaw Killer was dead.
Yeah, but if it's another copycat, it's gonna be a shit show.
Right from the outset, this one actually looked like it might fit into that bold new direction angle that I was talking about. Compared to the previous films, which sort of balance the traps and police investigation storylines pretty evenly, this one instead focuses on the police stuff a lot more. The plot of this one follows Detective Zeke Banks, played by Chris Rock of all people.
Me no want no partner.
He's been tasked with investigating a series of new murders from a Jigsaw-inspired killer, along with a new rookie, Detective William Shank, all the while dealing with a precinct full of corrupt cops and a strained relationship with his father, retired police chief Marcus Banks. I'll give the movie credit that it feels like there's a genuine attempt to try something different here, having the movie de-emphasize the traps to a certain extent and center more on the murder mystery aspect by focusing on outsiders looking in. That can add a different type of suspense and intrigue that the movies have dabbled in but never fully focused on. Not to mention, we could also get some pretty good character drama by delving into Zeke's personal life and struggles in a crooked police force. Unfortunately, despite that potential, I can't say that the movie really pulls through on any of it. One of the big reasons for this is that for most of the runtime, the plot goes nowhere. Oh, sure, traps happen throughout the movie and the characters investigate them, but they never make any progress with narrowing down who the killer is or tracking him down. And very little attention is paid to the killer's actual motivations. They try to establish that he's targeting dirty cops and punishing them in the same way that Jigsaw did.
I'm here to help reform the Metro Police, to remind them of their oath to the people of this city.
But the movie barely shows any of the crimes that these cops have committed. They mostly just vaguely allude to these crimes and, okay, maybe show a couple of them very briefly, but they never show that widespread harm that the police department as a whole is causing the city that they're supposed to be protecting. The movie keeps telling us that the crimes we see are a regular occurrence within the system, but with what little evidence we're presented with, they come off more as just isolated incidents. And Zeke himself is not that interesting of a character either. To be fair, he is more fleshed out than any of the characters in Jigsaw, since he does seem to have an actual life outside of the plot. Like I said, he has a distant relationship with his father and wife.
Dad, we live in the same building. We haven't had a meal together in over a year.
So, guessing you're divorced.
I'm going through a divorce.
But his father and wife are barely present throughout the movie, and so his difficulties with them are never explored and never become relevant to Zeke outside of giving the illusion that he has some kind of personal dilemma. The movie also seems a little confused about what it's trying to accomplish with him. They try to portray him as a good cop in a broken system, but when you see him in action, he commits crimes just like the other people on the force that he seems to hate. Granted, he doesn't murder anyone like some of the other cops in the movie, but he still disturbs the peace, threatens people with violence, and tortures someone during an interrogation.
Why don't you let me sterilize him?
The movie tries to explain that the reason he doesn't play by the rules is because the other cops will betray him if he relies on them for help, but he's still doing some pretty seriously wrong stuff, and the movie never condemns any of what he's doing. Then there are the traps, which, to be fair, are still pretty solid overall, since they still manage to be really tense, gory, and painful looking. And while I'm sure it was challenging to find a voice for the killer that would be a fitting replacement for Tobin Bell's performance, the artificial voice they went with sounds really creepy and uncanny and unsympathetic. I like it a lot.
Only your weight will rip away your lying tongue and save you.
But since these traps are given far less attention than in previous movies, I can't exactly say that they save the experience like with Jigsaw. However, they are similar to Jigsaw in the sense that they seem really easy to cheat, honestly more so. Like this trap here, this guy has to let this pulling machine rip his fingers off before the pool of water rises to an electrical wire which will kill him. And throughout the whole thing, I'm just wondering, why doesn't he just climb out of the pool onto the platform in front of him? This honestly seemed like such an obvious solution that when I was watching this movie for the review, I had to go back and rewatch the scene because I was just thinking, there's gotta be something that I missed. He has to be restrained to that pool or something. There's no way that they didn't think of that. But no, apparently the thought of being electrocuted was just so fear-inducing for him that he never considered just stepping out of the way. Or this one where the chief of police gets trapped in an evidence locker and is put through this trap where she's about to get her face covered in boiling hot wax. But her head and neck aren't restrained, so why doesn't she just lift her head up out of the way? I'm not saying she'd avoid the wax altogether, but it seems like she could at least dodge the worst of it and potentially survive. At least with the traps in Jigsaw, they would require a little thinking outside the box in order to cheat, but the solutions I'm suggesting for the traps here essentially boil down to just move your body slightly out of the way and you're good. To be honest, I don't really have a ton to say about Spiral outside of that. It essentially just takes the generic underdeveloped cop storyline from Jigsaw and makes it the central focus of the movie. Meanwhile, the elements that could at least make the movie some simple fun are just relegated to about 10 minutes of screen time. I think, in theory, the movie has more of a reason to exist than Jigsaw because it's at least trying to create a new take on the Saw franchise, but it's not a good movie, so that attempt just kind of gets wasted like the casting of Samuel L. Jackson. But that's not going to stop the studio from continuing the series yet again. At time of writing, Saw X has not been released yet. All we currently have to go on is this one trailer and this funny looking poster. So while I can't judge the movie just yet, I can at least speculate based on what I've seen, and much like Jigsaw, it mainly looks like just another Saw movie. I'm hoping that they'll do something with a premise that's both new and actually done well, but I can't say that I'm expecting it, so hopefully it'll at least have some cool traps to keep me entertained. I do have to question why they're making a prequel other than just to bring back Jigsaw yet again for fan service. I especially have to question it considering that the two previous movies introduced two new villains that are still on the loose, so why don't they get any kind of conclusion? You know, if you want us to think that you have a good reason for bringing this franchise back, it doesn't help when you seem to regard loose ends like these as so disposable. Shawnee Smith is also back reprising her role as Amanda Young from the original run of Saw movies, which, again, I'm struggling to see a reason for considering that her story was already pretty well covered there. The only thing that I can think of that could potentially make the movie stand out is that it looks like they're delving a little deeper into John Kramer's battle with cancer. It seems like they're going for a slightly more personal and sympathetic take on the character, with him targeting people that hurt him specifically.
You all pretended to cure me. But what I have planned for each of you is very real.
The trailer even gives us this very quick shot where Jigsaw is crying and hugging presumably Amanda. Whatever ends up happening, I doubt that this will be the last we see from the Saw franchise, and ideally I'd like to see them explore the concept in fresh and engaging ways and actually do a decent job of it, but I'm not necessarily counting on it. However, if the movies want to just continue being excuses for cool and creative traps, I'll take that for what it's worth. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to see newer videos even faster, then head over to my Patreon. I'll talk to you later.